Hello and welcome to the memory card. There's been a lot of talk in the retro gaming community lately about the N64 controller, and that's thanks to a recent Kickstarter from a company called Retro Fighters. They did a redesign of the NES controller, and now they're wanting to do a modern redesign of the N64 controller. I've actually backed this Kickstarter, so whenever I get my controller in the mail, I'll do a review of it and let you all know what I think of it. But in the meantime, I figured I should talk a bit about the N64 controller proper, the original. I seem to be one of the few people that doesn't hate this controller. I actually really like it. I don't think it's one of the best controllers ever or anything like that. It's not my favorite Nintendo controller. I wouldn't say it's up in the upper echelon like the GameCube controller or the Switch Pro controller, but it's not as bad as people say.
The N64 was Nintendo's first real foray into the exciting new world of 3D gaming. There were a few Super Nintendo games like Star Fox that managed to squeeze rudimentary 3D graphics from the Super Nintendo, but that was nothing like people would see on the N64. So, to coincide with this revolutionary console, Nintendo needed an equally revolutionary controller. Now, this was the first time that a D-pad and an analog thumbstick were put together on a home console controller. And this does actually predate the DualShock 1 controller from the PlayStation 1 by about a year or so. Nintendo was venturing into pretty uncharted waters with the N64, and in a lot of ways, it's definitely reflected in this controller design. I can kind of see the thought behind the design of this controller. There's basically two correct ways to hold the controller. For in general, with 3D games, you hold the controller in the middle like this, and for 2D games, you hold the outer grips like this. The main problem with this design is that there is no good way to hold the controller and have access to every button on the controller, so programmers were limited in their button inputs for games. But despite the flaws of this controller, I still think it's really comfortable, largely because the designs of these handles just really conforms to your hand really well, whether you're holding it on the outer sides or in the middle. There's really great contours on this controller. One other notable feature of the N64 controller is this port on the back. This was mainly used for three different attachments: the controller pack, the rumble pack, and the transfer pack. The controller pack is essentially the memory card of the Nintendo 64, and I like this design overall. It's very sturdy feeling, feels good in the hand. I like that it has the notes here, so you could write down with a Sharpie like Turok saves or Robotron 64 saves. I like that it has the thumb indent here, so that way, whenever you click it in, it's easy for your thumb to get in and release it with the help of this button here. Also, I like that the controller pack is flush with the port here, and it doesn't really add any substantial weight to the N64 controller, which is nice. Now, the rumble pack is another aspect of what makes the N64 controller and the console itself revolutionary. With the help of just a couple AAA batteries, your controller would rumble whenever you take a shot in Star Fox 64 or hit a wall with your sword in Ocarina of Time. This was actually the first home console controller that could vibrate and rumble, and now this has become standard in pretty much every controller, and it's pretty crazy how it took a huge battery-powered brick to put this in the N64, and yet it just manages to fit into every controller nowadays without any real noticed bulk. It's definitely crazy how technology has changed over the years. And one other interesting thing about the Rumble Pack is that when this first was released, it came packaged with Star Fox 64, which is one of the best games that uses the Rumble Pack. It was definitely a good way to show to kids in the 90s how cool this thing really was. Another instance of Nintendo being way ahead of the time and creating something that would become industry standard. Now, the transfer pack is something that's pretty interesting. This is actually the transfer pack that I had as a kid, and my actual copy of Pokemon Red that has a kit as well. It's even got my initials put in there that my mom put in with a pen when I was a kid. The main purpose of the transfer pack was to transfer your party from Pokemon Red, Yellow, Blue, Silver, Gold, Crystal into Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2. And that was all I knew that this thing could do back in the day. But it turns out that you could actually play Pokemon first or second generation in Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2 by going to the Game Boy Tower. I wish I would have known about this as a kid because I always wanted to be able to play my Pokemon games on the TV, and I could have done that with this thing, but I just never knew I could. Luckily, I've rectified that mistake. I've been playing it a fair amount, although nowadays I use better alternatives. The transfer pack is cool, but is definitely outclassed by the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy Player for the GameCube. With those, you can pretty much play every game for the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. We're talking about the Game Boy Player. But with the transfer pack, it's really only used for Pokemon and apparently for Mario Golf, and I think it's just a couple other games. It's really limited. But whenever you do play a Pokemon game with the transfer pack, you get some cool borders around the game, which is nice. For my Pokemon Silver review, I actually filmed a bit of footage using this thing, and it has a pretty cool border for Silver version. And I think that's a nice touch. And Nintendo actually made a lot of different color variations for the N64 controller, but this gray controller and the Atomic Purple, I believe it's called, were the only ones I really knew about as a kid, and I always thought this controller was awesome because it was see-through, and that was so 90s. I'm kind of glad that they brought back the translucent design with the Switch Pro controller. It's nowhere near as noticeable as it is on the N64 controller, but it is still cool. The only other color variations I have is this Toys R Us Pale Gold, which is really cool, and this darker blue. I like both of these controllers, but I most of the time tend to use the standard gray controllers, mostly because a couple of my gray controllers have the better thumbsticks. As over time, these things wear out, unfortunately. There were a lot of cool color variations done by Nintendo, but there weren't any new controllers. There wasn't like the classic controller for the Wii or anything like that. And there weren't really any good third-party alternatives back in the day, so if you didn't like this controller, you were pretty much stuck with it. That is, if you didn't want to deal with some awful, cheap-feeling third-party controller, like those super pads and stuff like that. And up until now, people have sworn that the Hori mini gamepad for the N64 is the best alternative, but those controllers can cost pretty much double the price of an N64, so it's not really realistic for most people. In fact, the steep price tag of a Hori mini gamepad for the N64 is the main reason I've never bothered trying to buy one. They're just so expensive and hard to get.
It's definitely a flawed controller, but I think it gets a lot of unnecessary hate from people. There's plenty of games that use a controller really well, like Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. In fact, trying to play Ocarina or Majora's Mask on any system other than a 3DS or an N64 is just not as good because only the N64 has the C buttons, and trying to play the Ocarina with the C stick on the GameCube or the right analog stick on a Wii or a Wii U from the Virtual Console is just not as good. It's just nowhere near as accurate. But my one big problem with the N64 controller is how easily the thumbstick wears out over time. Trying to find a used N64 controller with a thumbstick that is in any kind of good condition is a pain. That's one thing I hope the Retro Fighters controller will address. That, and I'm pretty sure my friends will complain less when we play N64 if they get to use that controller rather than the N64 Pitchfork. But regardless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the memory card.